In this video, Jordan Peterson explains the difference between talent and intelligence.
One of the things you might ask yourself is exactly what does intelligence measure? So we'll start with intelligence and that would be equivalent to intellect, roughly speaking. So intellect in the big five, the aspect seems to be associated with interest in ideas, whereas the openness proper aspect seems to be associated with aesthetic sensibility and creativity. That's the best way to think about it as far as we've been able to figure out. And the biggest relationship is between intellect and intelligence as measured psychometrically. Now, intelligence is an interesting concept. It's very controversial. In fact, one of the things that continually happens over and over again in psychology is that psychologists discover all sorts of new kinds of intelligence. And the biggest two proponents of that sort of thing, I suppose, were Bob Sternberg, who came up with this thing he called practical intelligence, and then Howard Gardner, who came up with the theory of multiple intelligences, which had a very large effect on educational psychology when the theory was first proposed. And that's not saying much, because generally speaking, it's very difficult to find a discipline that's more susceptible to fads than educational psychology. And as far as I can tell, generally speaking, each fad is worse than the previous one. So, Gardner posited that I think there were seven or eight different intelligences: linguistic, musical, logical, mathematical, spatial, body kinesthetic, intrapersonal, and interpersonal. And people talk about emotional intelligence, and they talk about practical intelligence. And as far as I'm concerned, all of that's complete rubbish. And there's technical reasons for that. I mean, there's technical and philosophical reasons for that. The first thing is, you can't just mess up a word. The whole point of having a word is so that it defines some things, it describes some things, and doesn't describe other things, right? And so you can make the word intelligence account for whatever you want. So you can say that the ability to dance is a form of intelligence. But the problem with that is you blur out the word so badly you can't tell what it means anymore. And I would also point out, we had perfectly good words for those major intelligences. We called them talents. And so it's perfectly reasonable to make a distinction between a talent and intelligence. Now, you might say, well, how the hell do you know the difference? Like, if things look similar to some degree, then how do you know if they're the same or different? Well, that's exactly what you do when you do the construct validity process. So let's say you rated a number of people on their dancing ability, and then you rated a number of people on their ability to multiply two-digit numbers in their head quickly. Well, then, you see, technically, if both of those were intelligences, then the people who could dance better could multiply two-digit numbers faster in their head. And they would be slightly positively, See, that's what happens when I don't have any Diet Coke. So anyways, if intelligence was the right word to subsume both of those, then what you'd see is there would be a high correlation. The people who were good dancers would also be the ones who could multiply most rapidly. And I mean multiply in their head. But you're not going to be able to extract out a single factor like that. It's just not the case that those things associate like that. So, for something to be one phenomena, all the things that are subsumed under that definition have to be correlated, and highly correlated, because otherwise they're not the same thing. It's the definition of the same thing. Now, IQ is a very peculiar construct, a very unique construct from a psychological perspective, but also more generally from a social science perspective, because IQ has the most predictive validity of anything ever discovered in the social sciences, period. Now, the other thing that is interesting about IQ is that a lot of the people who were interested early in the measurement of intelligence were engineers turned psychologists. And the engineers have actually had quite a whopping effect on psychology. part of the reason that psychology has an advanced methodology and advanced statistical techniques is because we got invaded by engineers in the early part of the 20th century. And so the engineers made our measurements much more rigorous than they would have otherwise been. And it's been a huge advantage. I mean, one of the things that's happening to psychology is that it's starting to eat other disciplines. So it's had a massive effect on economics, and it's going to have a massive effect on political science. And the reason for that is because we know how to measure things. And it actually turns out to matter that you know how to measure things. Obviously, I mean, if you're going to be talking about something that's specific and well-defined, first of all, if you can't make it specific and well-defined, all you can really do is argue about it. And, you know, there are better and worse arguments, but the problem is that just because an argument is good doesn't mean it's right. And that's a big problem. It's also something to remember when you're arguing about people that you have a relationship with, because, you know, if you happen to be better at structuring your arguments and you're more verbally fluent and perhaps more assertive and maybe less agreeable, you're going to win the arguments. But that doesn't mean you're right. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. And so as far as I can tell, the empirical process is the only way of getting rid of restricting or eliminating the catastrophically detrimental effects of pure theory. And our measurement techniques have been pretty good about that. Okay, so now what happens with IQ? Here, I can define IQ for you, just so you know what it is. So, imagine that you had a library of questions. So here's some questions. So, there's millions of questions in this data bank. What's 2 times 68? What's the capital of Georgia? What's the definition of hypertrichonemia? What comes after in this sequence? 2, 4, 8, 16. Remember these numbers. So I'd tell you the numbers and then you'd have to tell me them back. 2, 4. 1, 3, 5, 7. 6, 12, 15, 14, 18, 20, 22. And then I might ask you, in fact, to remember them backwards. And that's a working memory test. So, okay, so those are all questions that require abstraction and mental operations. That's the key, as far as I can tell. So you might say, well, exactly what constitutes an abstraction? And it looks to me like what an abstraction is. There's the capacity to formulate an abstraction, and there's the capacity to manipulate them. To formulate an abstraction, I think what you do is you take a phenomena and you represent it with something that's low resolution. That's more or less what an abstraction is. So, for example, if I imagine this classroom later, my imagined representation is going to be of much lower resolution than the actual classroom. But it's sufficient for certain purposes, just like a thumbnail on a computer is sufficient for certain purposes. And then once I simplify the phenomena in question, then I can also perform certain operations on it, say in imagination or semantically, and the capacity to generate that abstraction and the ability to manipulate those seems to be the core element of intelligence. And I think part of the reason why intelligence, roughly speaking, is a human dimension, although, you know, obviously you can to some degree rank order animals in terms of their capacity to learn, but there's this whopping differentiation between human beings and animals in this area particularly, is because we can use abstractions. Now,